Hello everybody and welcome to First Attack here on the Chensor Dynasty. I am James Chen, your host at twitch.tv/jchensor. If you guys don't know what First Attack is the series of videos and streams where I try to teach beginners all about fighting games, how to play fighting games, how to learn fighting games, and how to become stronger at fighting games. In today's episode, we are talking about this concept that you hear about everywhere, Footsies. Footsies is something that you hear about everywhere. Even if you're new to fighting games, you sit there and you talk to people, you listen to commentators, or it's like, this player has great footsies, and oh man, you gotta learn footsies, and oh, my footsies are godlike, etc., etc. What does this even mean? Like, what is, that's such a weird term to have started purveying through the fighting game community, because it's like, what is this even about, right? Well, so I'm going to do my best to explain footsies to people. Now, one of the things that I want to establish right from the get-go here is that footsies is a very, very complicated subject. It's a very complicated topic. So I'm going to do my best to try to simplify it for you guys as possible, okay? So, again, if you guys have feedback on how I can if anything I say is not clear, or if there's a topic that I talk about that I think people are going to understand, feel free to send me feedback. I'll give a bunch of feedback links at the bottom, at the end of the stream. But let's start. Let's talk about footsies. What are footsies? What are footsies, right? Well, again, it's one of the most vague terms in fighting games. You hear this all the time, and it doesn't describe anything. It doesn't help you learn anything. Well, there's another term that people throw around called fundamentals, right? This is what this guy has good fundamentals. Well, largely fundamentals are considered kind of synonymous with footsies. People talk about neutral. In the last episode, I said neutral and footsies aren't 100% synonymous. Footsies are a major factor of playing the neutral. However, I do believe that footsies and fundamentals are nearly interchangeable, because footsies are in every fighting game, right? As I mentioned, they are the most important part to neutral. But the thing about it is footsies is the main and most important part of playing fighting games. In years past, when I've tried to teach fighting games, I compared it to a bunch of mini games that you're playing at the same time, all at once in rapid succession. You're playing RPS, you're playing, the hand slapping game, you're playing all these mini games all at the exact same time. Well, footsies, if you take all these components of fighting games and pretend they're mini games, footsies is the one that you will be playing probably the most out of all of the games. So let's talk about footsies here. Like I said, every fighting game has footsies in it. I don't care what game you're talking about. There's going to be different degrees of footsies. If you play a chaotic game, such as Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, it may not feel like there's a lot of footsies there, but trust me, there are plenty of footsies going on. If you play a slow-paced game like Samurai Showdown, that has footsies everywhere. Every fighting game has footsies in some form or another. And regardless of the game that you're playing, footsies are almost always going to be similar because of these basic tenets here. The first one being that footsies is going to be very movement based. I can't stop repeating this. I've said this since episode 1. Movement. Movement is the most important part of fighting games. And movement is going to be the most important part about footsies. Another part is spatial recognition. Okay, this is an interesting topic here. We've been very psychological, philosophical about fighting games. This is probably one of the first, things that's not actually philosophical that I'm going to be really emphasizing here. Footsies is going to require a lot of spatial recognition. If you have trouble just measuring distance by just through visuals, just by looking at something, or if you have trouble figuring out how things relate to each other in a spatial plane, footsies are going to be a little bit more difficult for you. But again, this is a very, very visual, fundamental kind of skill that you need. Another one that's very important about footsies is going to be stage positioning. One of the hardest things about fighting games that people don't teach right at the very beginning is that when you play in a play field, right? I don't care if it's Street Fighter and you've got this horizontal field. I don't care if it's Guilty Gear and you've got a little bit of a taller field like this that's like 2 characters high. I don't care if you're talking about Marvel, like Marvel vs. Capcom 2, which requires a much taller field because people can super jump all the way to the top of the screen. It doesn't... Tekken! I don't care if you're talking about Tekken, which has infinite stages or has stages with walls, Soul Calibers, stages with ring outs, etc., etc. Stage recognition will always be a massive, massive part of footsies. Understanding where you are on the stage and what you're trying to fight for. You hear commentators say this a lot. Fighting for real estate. He has a lot of real estate. That is because the amount of space that you technically own in a fighting game is so important and one of the most important elements that you need to understand. In fact, I probably should have made this a jchensor axiom. So let's just say that jchensor axiom right away. Don't stage positioning and awareness of stage size and where you and your opponents are in a stage is probably one of the most fundamental aspects of fighting games that a lot of people don't look at immediately. Now, one of the things I do want to say is that footsies are going to be very character dependent. How you want to play footsies, what your goal in footsies are, will be skewed by the characters that you play, right? Some characters kind of don't want to play footsies. They actually want to zone you, for example. There are characters that try to keep you away as far as possible and prevent you from getting in. The other character's kind of playing footsies to try to get in, but the zoner is trying to keep them out and playing more of a defensive kind of thing, etc., etc. There's a lot of concepts, and this is one of the toughest things about fighting games, right? There's a lot of concepts. However, I'm going to be focusing mostly on the fundamental concepts of footsies to start with, all right? So, let's actually get into playing footsies now. What are footsies, okay? There are 3 main components of footsies, okay? These are the fundamental building blocks of footsies. This is going to be a very, very important slide here, okay? So keep this slide in mind for the rest. In fact, I'll probably be jumping back to this slide a lot during the course of this. But the Footsies Triangle, the rock, paper, scissors of footsies. And in case you really don't know what rock, paper, scissors is, I'll just explain. It's a game where you guys go 1, 2, and then you either choose rock, paper, or scissors, right? Rock blunts scissors, right? Like the damage the scissors. Paper wraps a rock and scissors cuts papers. So it's like Mega Man, right? You have a triangle of things that beat each other, right? And because of that, you end up with a kind of like nothing is overpowered because they all have a weakness. They beat something, but they also lose to something. That is what footsies is all about. So here is the Footsies Triangle. The footsies, rock, paper, scissors. The first one is poking and space controlling, okay? This is you actively hitting buttons. Now remember, in some of the previous streams that I've done for First Attack, I've said hitting buttons is not what your goal should be in fighting games. You should, be very selective. The economy of buttons, as I talked about in previous episodes. Well, you do hit buttons and attack every once in a while. When do you do that? In the poking and space controlling section of fighting games, right? So that's basically the first concept of footsies, is poking and space controlling, where you're actually attacking. Now, what poking and space controlling beats in the footsies RPS is forward movement. This is one of the fundamental, again, I'm going to be saying this a lot, fundamental. This is why it's called fundamentals. So forward movement is basically making your character walk forward. like actually trying to take space and trying to claim the stage and trying to apply pressure on your opponent. What you'll actually see from a lot of beginners, and this happened in a video that Atomatic posted up for Grand Blue Fantasy Versus, was an opponent who wasn't familiar with fighting games. The very first thing they did was walk backwards at the start of the match, put themselves in the corner, and they immediately lost. One of the most important things in fighting games to do is to move forward, is to claim your space. And again, this is such a weird concept and not obvious, right? Like, to have moving forward be one of the most fundamental aspects of fighting games is a very kind of strange idea if you're not familiar with fighting games. But as you play it, you'll find out that this is something you have to master. It's a weird thing to sound like to master. You hold forward on the controller, you walk forward. It's easy, right? It's not that easy. So, but the most important thing is that forward movement beats whiff punishing. Whiff punishing is a fundamental skill in fighting games as well. Again, fundamental. Sorry if I keep repeating that word. But again, different games will have different levels of whiff punishing. But this is a way to really stifle the opponent. You are trying to stifle the opponent from actually accomplishing any of what they're trying to do. So if they're trying to attack you or if they're trying to poke you and stuff like that, you can end up whiff punishing them. So needless to say, whiff punishing beats poking and space control. So here we have the Footsies Triangle: poking and space control, forward movement, and whiff punishing. Now, I talked about this in this order here of poking beats forward movement, beats whiff punishing, beats poking space control. I'm going to talk about each of these sections one by one now. I'm going to talk about each of these sections one by one, and I'm going to do it in the reverse order. Okay, so I'm going to talk about poking space controlling first, and then I'm going to talk about whiff punishing because I want to show you why whiff punishing beats poking and space controlling. Then I'm going to talk about forward movement, show you why forward movement beats whiff punishing, and then I'll show you why poking and space controlling beats forward movement, etc., etc. So let's go to the first section: poking and space controlling. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking right now. James, we need visual examples. I've been hearing a lot of that feedback there. They're coming. Let me get through poking and we will get to the visual examples. So if you're excited for some visual samples, they are coming right up. So let's get started talking about poking and space controlling here. To establish this right now, poking and space controlling is the most aggressive part of Footsies, okay? The reason why I say this is because you are actively doing stuff. You're attacking, you're pressing buttons, you're trying to actually throw out moves. I've talked about this in the past where you don't want to hit a lot of buttons. You know, I mentioned this earlier, the economy of buttons and stuff. Well, this part of Footsies is actually you hitting the buttons, because you got to hit the buttons at some point in time or you're not doing anything. Well, poking and space controlling is all about hitting the buttons. However, there's two halves of that. The reason why it's listed as poking / space controlling is because there's really kind of two halves of this part of Footsies, right? There is the offensive portion, which is what poking is, and there's the defensive side of everything, which is what space controlling is all about, right? Poking is where you're trying to be offensive. This is you actually trying to hit the opponent with your buttons, okay? This is you actively trying to hit them. You are trying to get in range where your move can reach them, and you are forcing them to block your move, or you're just trying to hit them with the move. So this is you being active and aggressive. This is you trying to frustrate and fluster the opponent. In this portion of Footsies, poking, this subset of poking / space controls, you are looking for moves that are fast and have good range, okay? These are buttons that you are trying to press that will reach the opponent, that have the ability to get to the opponent. So that is what you are focusing on when you're looking for moves that can actually facilitate your offensive poking. Now, this could be normal moves. You know, we've talked about fighting buttons and everything like that, but buttons can also be used to activate special moves, and a lot of fighting games, actually almost all fighting games, have those special moves. And a lot of special moves are going to be very, very useful in the offensive poking game. For example, a Balrog dash punch in Street Fighter V, you know, where he sits there and he dashes forward with a really far range punch. That is a great special move for poking, for being offensive. Now, your goals while you are trying to be offensive and poking at people is to annoy and aggravate the opponent. You're just trying to put pressure on them. You are trying to fluster them as much as possible and then give yourself an opportunity to apply pressure and gain advantage. Do you guys remember the flow chart that I talked about in the very first episode? I talked about the neutral, which leads to aggression and pressure and advantage, right? And then that leads to mix-ups, which leads to combos, right? So when you are using poking as an offense and you are trying to be aggressive, you are trying to scare the opponent into being overly defensive, being scared. You're trying to get them to kind of turtle up and shell up and clam up a little bit so that the opponent starts making mistakes. You can make them either block too much, so that means you can sneak in a throw. You're trying to frustrate them so much so that they jump at you so you get a free anti-air, etc., etc. You're trying to cause the opponent to make mistakes because you are just aggravating them by poking them all the time. And it's literally like, hey, 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 you know, death by 1,000 cuts. You're forcing an opponent to make a mistake. And that will give you the setup, the advantage, the pressure. Whether this is by knocking them down with a move that actually pokes and knocks down, or being able to cancel a normal move into a special move. In most fighting games, you can cancel a lot of normal attacks into special moves, and some of those special moves will lead you to be able to have advantage. You can also just the move itself. The move itself might even give you that kind of pressure right from the get-go. And again, we'll see a lot of examples of these. Don't worry, the visual examples are coming. I just want to get through all the concepts first, and then I will start showing you some examples of this. Now, here's the thing, though. Poking and space control, well, at least poking and hitting buttons, right, is just attacking somebody is the easiest thing to learn. It's super intuitive. It's instinctive, right? When you play a fighting game, like I said, most people when they play fighting games, the first thing they do is just hit buttons a lot. They're just hitting buttons, hitting buttons, hitting buttons, hitting buttons. They're just trying to poke. They're just trying to hit the opponent as much as possible. So this is actually the easiest part of Footsies to learn. This is why I wanted to talk about this particular section first. However, like I said, economy of buttons. I'm going to keep repeating terms like this because I want to drill these terms into your head, right? Even though it's easy to learn and it's instinctive for you to want to hit buttons, because you hit buttons in every video game, right? In a first-person shooter, you're just shooting at people. If you're playing, you know, a 3D perspective game like God of War, you just want to swing your weapon and kill everything. But again, learn not to abuse this. Remember, movement, movement, movement. Another concept that I continue to repeat over and over again. So even though you want to try to poke as much as you can because hitting buttons feels like that's what you're supposed to do, don't do that. If you hit buttons too much and you don't understand why you're hitting the buttons, you remember this? I talked about this in the previous episode. If you don't know why you're hitting the buttons, if I ask you, why did you hit that button, and you don't have a distinct answer for me, if you're just saying, I really hope that it hits the opponent, you are falling into one of the most fundamental traps in fighting games that I call hopesies. You aren't playing footsies anymore, you're playing hopesies. You're hitting buttons just to hit buttons and hoping the opponent gets hit by them, right? This is not how you want to poke at people. You want to have very calculated times of when you poke. You want to understand the distancing of your poke. You want to understand why this causes pressure on your opponent. This is where a lot of the psychological aspects of fighting games come from. While you're poking at your opponent, you want to be able to recognize when your opponent gets frustrated and how to take advantage of that. All of you people out there with siblings, when you do that little stupid thing where you're like, hey, look, I'm poking you, or hey, I'm not touching you, hey, I'm not touching you, you can almost kind of always sense the moment your sibling like loses it, right? You can see that boil coming up and all of a sudden the explosion is imminent, right? You can detect that. You can do the same thing in fighting games. The more you play, the more you start recognizing the behavior of your opponents, and you will start understanding when your poking can be aggravating and annoying enough to make the opponent cause mistakes or to scare them enough to clam up so that you can get in on them and set up your advantage and pressure, etc., etc. So that is the offensive side to hitting buttons, to doing attacks, to poking / space controlling. Well, space controlling is a different concept, but it's the defensive side of this, okay? This is not about you being aggressive. Space controlling is not about being aggressive. This is about being anticipatory. This is a very predictive section of Footsies, okay? This is about you trying to predict what the opponent is going to do. And, you know, I call it anticipatory, I call it predictive. There's a lot of guessing here as well. If you talk to people about fighting games and they say there's no guessing in fighting games, the worst fighting games are about like, that's complete, absolute, utter nonsense. Okay, there's a lot of guessing in fighting games, but it's all educated guessing based off of, again, understanding the psychology of your opponents, right? In the situation of poking and space controlling, instead of looking for moves that are fast and have range, you are looking for the direction of your move. And if the move has priority. Priority, the reason why I put in quotes, is an old school term people have used. We didn't understand how fighting games worked on a technical standpoint. When two people attacked and one of them won, we just said, it has more priority. We didn't really understand the concept of hit boxes and hurt boxes, which is a very technical thing about fighting games that I will teach in the future. But for now, just understand that there is a science to why moves beat other moves. Well, some moves just have a higher probability of beating other moves, and we can generically call that priority for now, right? Some games there's actual priority. Street Fighter V has a priority system built into it. Games like Tekken have moves that automatically crouch under high attacks or automatically go over low attacks, for example. So there are different concepts of priority out there, but just understand that there are moves out there that tend to beat other moves more often than not, okay? So again, direction and priority are what you're looking for. And in fact, with space controlling, sometimes you're looking for shorter ranged moves. So that's that. You might not be looking for anything with good distance at all. And I'll show you a great example of that very shortly. And again, very prediction, very guess-based. As I mentioned, guess, yes, there's guessing involved. And like I said, once we get to the examples, I will show you what I mean by a lot of guessing. And again, a lot of this is very overwhelming. I've been talking for quite some time now, but we are almost at the visual examples here, and you'll start seeing a lot of this, okay? But your goals in space controlling, the idea of what you're doing in space controlling here is you're trying to limit the opponent's movement. You're hitting buttons to preemptively stop the opponents from trying to approach you. So you'll see in a lot of games, like in Tekken, like in Street Fighter, people will try to dash at you and try to get in your face and attack you, right? So a lot of times when you're throwing out buttons preemptively, this is called space controlling because you are trying to claim this section in front of you. You are throwing a move out in this space. You're here, the opponent's here, and there's this space in between you guys. And what you're doing is you're preemptively throwing out moves into this space, so when the opponent comes into that space, they get hit by it. And when they see you swinging those moves to cover that space, now they're scared to walk into that space. In other words, you are trying to claim that property as yours. You are controlling that space. This is a concept that Seth Killian has really defined very well in a Domination 101 article. I'll tell you guys all about that at the end of the stream here. Now again, like I said, priority, super generic term. I'll get into what priority means in the future, but basically you're using the priority of your moves basically to beat their pokes as well. This is not necessarily limiting their movement. This is limiting their ability to try to poke at you, to try to swing at you, because the opponent is going to be trying to poke at you as well on the offensive side of things, right? Your opponent is sitting here trying to poke at you a bunch of times. And so space controlling is a good way to stop their poking. You can hit their moves for basically punishing them for trying to swing at you. Now, of course, the downside to space controlling is, I said this in the first episode, the reason why you want economy of buttons is because every time you do any form of attack, you are committing to something. Whenever you do an attack, you are stuck doing that attack. If I swing with a heavy punch, if I swing with a right punch, if I swing with a heavy attack, my character is going to do this, and then he's got to pull back, and then he's going to recover. Anytime you do any attack, you are committing to that attack for a period of time. And while you are committed to that, you are stuck on that move. And if your opponent didn't do anything, they could take advantage of this. There are so many ways to take advantage of you wildly swinging away, trying to control space, that you don't want to become too obsessed with this. If all of your game just comes down to you just hitting buttons all day to try to control space, you will not get very far. Now again, a lot of people I know are thinking to themselves, you know what, this is very confusing. This is very confusing. I need visual examples. Well, here we go. Let's start with your visual example. Before we actually get into this visual example, I want to say this. For most of this episode, I'm going to be using Street Fighter V. Street Fighter V is one of the most Footsies heavy games out there. It is a, well, I should say fundamentally footsie heavy game, right? A lot of the other games, like I said, they all have footsies out there, but some of them are a little more wild and have little extra concepts that kind of layer on top of that. Street Fighter V has very, very straightforward footsies kind of game. So I'm going to use this as an example, but I don't want people to think that Footsies is Street Fighter V or Street Fighter V is Footsies. Every game has Footsies, and this is something very important that I want to establish to everybody before I do these visual examples. I may switch between games if I really feel the need to, but for the most part, I'm going to stick with Street Fighter V so we have one cohesive example of what Footsies are. So let's go ahead and start this here. Here we go. And Footsies. So what I'm going to do here is I am going to start with the concept of poking, right? So what I'm going to do is probably use one of the strongest Footsies characters in the game, which is Chun-Li here, all right? So what I'm going to show you guys basically is what you're looking for when you are trying to poke at the opponent, when you are trying to annoy them, when you are trying to be aggressive against them, okay? So the reason why I've picked Chun-Li is I mentioned that a lot of moves out there need to have speed and range. Well, Chun-Li is one of those characters that have some of the best speed and range of buttons of all characters. And I have Lucia crouching on purpose here because I want to show you that a lot of these buttons will hit them even when they're crouching, right? But this, for example, is an excellent poking tool right here. This is a great tool because look at the range that this has. And it's a pretty fast move. And so if your opponent is, you know, trying to find their own Footsies games and they're trying to play Footsies against you, you can really shut down what the opponent is trying to do with this button here. In fact, we've seen games where a player like Ricky Ortiz has almost won entire rounds with this singular button alone. And this is one important concept about the neutral and Footsies. If something's working, keep doing it. Keep doing it. Don't stop, right? So this is a great button right here for Footsies right here. And actually, let me do something else over here for you guys. Pew! Poking and space controlling. That is the topic of the stream currently. So this is another button, not quite as long range, but still faster than this button. And at this range, a very good poking tool. This is another good one. This is stand medium kick from Chun-Li. This one, by the way, is forward or back plus medium punch for Chun-Li. Again, where these buttons are, not important. Please understand the concept of these moves. You can see the range, you can see the speed of this, and you can see why this is an excellent poking tool. So when I'm poking, I'm not going to sit here and do this. Oops, I'm not going to sit here and do this. This is unsuccessful poking. This is hopetsies right here. If I'm sitting this far away from the opponent and I'm doing this all day, this is hopetsies. This is what I'm telling you not to do. The way that you want to play poking in footsies is you want to make sure you get into the range of your opponent and you are actively trying to hit your opponent. You are actively trying to hit them and annoy them with your attacks. And like I said, this can lead to a lot of different things, right? So, for example, because Chun-Li has these range, you can get the opponent to stop hitting buttons because you just keep hitting them when they're trying to do stuff so that they stop moving. And so, as I said, one of your goals is if they get scared because you're hitting so many buttons and you're beating them all the time, I can dash up. And as soon as I dash up, I catch them off guard because they're expecting me to poke again. I walk into this range where my standing heavy punch is going to hit them. They clam up because they're like, oh boy, here comes standing heavy punch again. So when I walk into my standing heavy punch range, instead of hitting standing heavy punch like this, I walk up here and dash forward. Now I'm in their face. Now I'm aggressive. Now I've transitioned the phase of the fighting game to the next stage. I've gone from neutral to advantage and pressure, right? I have been playing footsies neutral here, getting them scared of my buttons like this to the point where once they stop hitting the buttons, I dash forward and now I have advantage and now I'm applying pressure. That is how poking will get me the ability to advance to the next phase of fighting games. I have gone from neutral to aggression and pressure. There are other ways to do this as well. One thing that I do want to mention here before we continue forward, I have talked about the word whiff before. We talked about whiff punishing, etc., etc. Just so people understand the concept of whiffing, that just basically means, like, think of it like a baseball player. They swing the ball at the bat, they swing the bat at the ball, and when they miss, they whiff. So that's all you want to think of it as. If you whiff, you are just missing the opponent. You are not hitting them, right? But here, what I want to give you another example of is another great poke that exists in Street Fighter V. And that is Zangoose Heavy Punch here. Great button here that reaches very far. And not only that, but you can hold the button down. And see, at this range, I whiff. But if I hold the button down, I charge up, and Zangoose actually comes a little forward and punches that way. So this is another great poke that exists in the game. And one of the things that makes this poke really good is because it's a little ambiguous if I'm going to do just punch right here or if I'm going to do the full charge punch, is that you'll actually get people to run into your full charge punch. Now, if you notice, if I hit the opponent with the full charge punch, it knocks them down, right? I have said in the previous episode, your goal in neutral is not to hit the opponent. Your goal is to gain the advantage so you can apply pressure. This is another great example that if I do hit them, hitting them is great. But what's the reward for this? The reward for this is the fact that I knock them down and I get to forward dash and go and attack them. Now, you know, in many games, they'll be able to try to quick rise off of this and get up off the floor right away. But I don't care. I just built distance, and now I'm in a pressure and an advantage range against the opponent right here. Just by landing this one button here, that gives me the advantage. So, yes, it's great that I hit them, but that is not my goal. My whole goal of poking and being offensive and being annoying by throwing out different poke buttons like this is to get them off their guard, to get hit by this button so I can knock him down and dash forward, and I am now in a pressure situation. You know, without going into too much character-specific details here, from here, I can keep poking. I can actually throw them, you know, with my command grabs and stuff like this. You know, like I said, I don't want to get into too much about that. We will talk about those kind of mix-ups in a future episode. But just by landing this one hit and me being able to dash forward afterwards, use my movement to go forward, that one poke awarded me with pressure and advantage. I've advanced the phases of a fighting game. I've gone from neutral to pressure and advantage. And again, a lot of it is going to come down by hitting different buttons and actively trying to hit them to get them scared to the point where I'm at this range and they're not expecting it to reach that far and I can hit them. Or I throw out the quick one and hit them with this, and then I throw out the longer one. They aren't expecting the longer one, and then you hit them with that, etc., etc. Your goal, again, is to use your poke to gain advantage. Let me show you another example. So here's another example of where poking on the offense can lead you to pressure, right? I showed an example of knocking down. I showed an example of Chun-Li trying to make the opponent clam up so you can dash up against him. Zangoose, I just wanted to hit you with a poke and knock you down. Here's a third example of what we want to do while poking. Rashid is a great character. Great poke here, like this, right? We've got some good pokes here. This is a good poke button here, right? Now, here's the thing. This is a very good button for Rashid, and a very if you watch a lot of Street Fighter V, you're going to see a lot of people poke this, right? With this button right here. One of the reasons that makes this button very powerful, however, that a lot of people don't understand, and again, how do I turn poking into advantage? Well, it's because this can be canceled into special moves like this, right? So I can cancel this button, and again, without getting too much into execution and fighting game systems, understand that, you know, there are special moves that you do with a motion and normals that you just do by hitting buttons. Many times in fighting games, I can cancel a normal move into a special move. So this is a normal move that if I don't cancel it, you see how it finishes with him swinging all the way through. But on hit, I can cancel it into a special move. This is a very common system in almost every fighting game. Again, don't worry about that. Just understand that it is possible. The details of canceling into special moves will be discussed in a future episode. But in order to explain fighting games, there's a lot of circular stuff here. And so I just want you to understand that this is a possibility, and this is something that can make poking very powerful. So why is this powerful here like this, right? If you can get the opponent scared of this button right here, so that they don't do anything after you do this button, I can cancel this into this tornado over here. Well, this tornado has a special property that it can be canceled into something called a V skill for Rashid here in Street Fighter V. Again, this is a very game-specific system, but I just want to show you an example of how this works. One of the V skills that Rashid has is he has the ability to roll forward, right? Well, it just so happens that this button here, that this special move here can be canceled into a roll. So without letting it end fully, I can cancel into a roll. So if you piece all of this together, if I just sit here and just try to throw a fireball like this in somebody's face, I could get hit for trying to do this. Like, they're trying to poke at me, right? Remember, fighting games are a two-player game. They're poking at me at the same time. So I'm not just going to walk up at this range and all of a sudden throw out this thing without getting hit by them poking at me. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to poke with this button, cancel it into this tornado, and then cancel the tornado into a roll, right? And Rashid has the ability to cancel this and do nothing. I've been kicking at the end of that because that's my mistake. I didn't mean to. But if I don't actually cancel that roll into a kick, I have rolled next to the opponent now. And without going into specifics of frame data, understand that whenever Rashid does this, he has an advantage now. He is in an advantage position against the opponent. So even though the opponent is defending against this, you can clearly see that I have Lucia set to guarding. So she's guarding my crouching attack. She's guarding my tornado attack here. But even though she's guarded all of it, by learning how to poke, by learning how to get into the proper range that I can do this attack, I have now turned my aggressive poke into an advantage. This is very, very important. Again, we have now seen 3 examples of this. With Chun-Li, you're just overwhelming their attacks with your pokes so that they clam up, so that you get free ability to move in on them. With Zangoose, I'm trying to hit them and then hit them with 1 key charged standing heavy punch to knock them down so that I get advantage. In this example here, remember, I said your goal in the neutral is not to hit the opponent, but to gain advantage. In this example with Rashid here, I'm not even doing damage to the opponent. I'm not even hitting them. They're blocking everything. Yet, I have been able to turn my offensive poking into an advantage, right? Because I get to roll into their face and I get to put pressure on them. This is your goal when it comes to offensively poking and and trying to play this aggressive, annoying Footsies style. This is what you want to focus on when you are playing poking. It is about these distances. And like I said, you want to make sure that you are in range so that your pokes are hitting them, right? You want to make sure that you are actually hitting people with your pokes. This is you being aggressive with your pokes like this. And remember, early on in the stream, I talked about spatial recognition, right? Well, you've got to understand that at this range, this button's going to hit. At this range, it's going to miss. Right? So if you are actively, aggressively trying to poke people, this is where a lot of the spatial recognition comes in. You want to know when you are just at range for these buttons to hit and just at range for those buttons to whiff. You want to know how close you are so that you can get this crouching heavy punch so that you can cancel it, etc., etc. Poking and being aggressive. You are trying to land your moves on the opponent so that you can gain an advantage in very, very different ways. But again, this may seem overwhelming, may seem a little intimidating, but this right here is the beauty of fighting games, right? Not to get all soapboxy philosophical on you, but the fact that so many characters have different options and that there are so many different ways to accomplish this same singular Footsies goal of trying to get into the opponent's face and have an advantage is what makes fighting games so beautiful. So there you go. That is a visual example of poking, offensive poking right there. However, we have not finished the visual examples yet because now I want to get into space controlling. This is the other half. If you guys don't remember, this is the other half of poking and space controlling. Remember, there's 2 halves here. Offense poking and defense space controlling. So what is space controlling exactly? What is space controlling? Well, I'm going to go back to Chun-Li over here, okay? All right, so we're going to show you an example now of what space controlling is. Chun-Li is just a great example. Like I said, she's like Footsies fundamentals in a box. Like she's the character that does all of this stuff for you, right? One of the reasons why Chun-Li has really good space controlling moves is because she just has very long range attacks that cover a lot of different angles. Not particularly fast, but it covers a lot of angles. And she also has moves with a lot of priority, okay? I'm just going to do this move, and like I said, I'm not going to explain priority very much right now, but I just want you to understand what that priority means. Your moves tend to win against the other person's move. So, we're talking about priority and space controlling here, right? So, one of the things that I've set up the training dummy for Lucia to do, as you can see here, is to continually poke with this standing medium kick. This is one of Lucia's best pokes, although it doesn't have great range. But you can see that, you know, it pokes pretty far. It has good distance. It has decent distance right here. And it actually does turn out to be a decent poke for Lucia. However, I talked about Chun-Li's back heavy punch as having a really good priority, right? What I'm trying to do by controlling space is that Lucia right here is trying to control this space right here. She's trying to control this area between us by poking at me and hitting me and getting me annoyed and stuff. But if I do Chun-Li back heavy punch, this move eats Lucia's standing medium kick for breakfast, okay? This move just basically destroys Lucia. And you can see here that I can do this at so many different ranges. So from this range here, I beat it. Okay, sure. From this range over here, there we go. At that range, you can beat it, etc., etc. However, what's nice about this is I don't need to be that close. And you can see that I can just kind of throw this out at this range almost willy-nilly. And there's really not much Lucia's going to be able to do. And basically, her standing medium kick doesn't work against me. This is the definition of a space controlling move where you're trying to limit your opponent's pokes. I'm not actively trying to hit my opponent with this, but I'm actively trying to predict them hitting a button. I am actively trying to predict Lucia hitting standing medium kick so that I can just completely destroy it through priority. And again, this is a great button for priority. Okay, so this is why you're going to see some players whiff things in front of other players, because they are just trying to completely take out the opponent's move directly, right? This is space controlling right here. This is one form of space controlling you are trying to beat by predicting / guessing your opponent's offensive pokes, right? So if you see them poking at you, you can do this and beat them. This is one form of space controlling. Let me show you another form of space controlling, okay? I'm going to record the dummy here. Once I see her crouch, I'm going to have her jump forward like this, right? So now basically I have the training mode dummy recorded. And by the way, if you guys are wondering what all these menus are, this is just the facilities in Street Fighter V that allow you to record the dummy to perform certain actions. So I just need the dummy to perform a certain action, so I want them to jump at me, for example. So I've mentioned very early on that Chun-Li's standing heavy kick is also a great space controlling tool as well. Well, letting people jump on you in fighting games is not a good thing. If someone actually can jump on you and you don't actually anti-air them and they get in on you, they get pressured. So you don't want them jumping in on you. Well, characters like Chun-Li can throw out moves like standing heavy kick. The biggest advantage of this standing heavy kick here is that it serves a dual purpose. One, it can hit standing opponents from pretty far away, as you can see, right? But again, your purpose is not to hit them. You're basically throwing this out like right here to make sure that if your opponent walks forward, they get hit by this, right? So you're stopping forward movement here. You're stopping the forward movement by hitting these buttons like this. So I'm hitting this button here because if she walks forward, she's going to get hit. But what's great about this button is it serves a dual purpose. That if you throw it out randomly sometimes, you might even hit them before they get to jump. So I am covering two options here. I am covering not only walking forward, but I am covering jumping as well. So in other words, if I record Lucia to 50-50, crouch back and walk forward, or crouch back and jump, and let the training mode randomly choose which of these two options I do, I am covering both of those scenarios. And this is what makes this so good. If she ever... There you go. So by hitting this one button, at a range that I'm not going to hit her normally, like so, I am covering both scenarios. This is the definition of a space controller. I am claiming this entire amount of space in front of Chun-Li by throwing this button out. I have thrown this button out here, and now the opponent is scared to walk forward. They're scared to jump. So by actively hitting buttons, I am predicting, guessing that they're going to do something, and you're going to catch them for it. So this is why you are going to hit buttons that just whiff outside of their ranges, because you are trying to limit their movement. I mentioned this in the slides earlier. You are trying to limit movement. So this button here is a great space controller because it'll just outright beat a lot of other buttons that come at you. And this button is great because it beats a lot of movement options. These are two great space controlling buttons. I'm going to show you one more example of good space controlling here. Okay, so I've switched the characters around now. I am controlling Lucia, right? It's weird, but this button right here is also a great space controller over here for Lucia. Why is this a great space controller? Well, I'm not going to stop anyone from walking forward, and I'm not going to stop anyone from jumping. And most likely, I already established that if Chun-Li decides to standing heavy punch, like so, that's a really good poke, right? So, you know, maybe you're like, oh, well, it's like that other Chun-Li button you were doing that has really good priority, right? Well, I mean, most likely if I hit this button out here, I'm just going to get punched in the face, right? So, like that, right? So if I hit this button, a lot of times I will get punched in the face like this, right? See? So it's not exactly the best button in terms of priority. It's not going to beat them a lot of the time. But what is the point of me throwing this as a space controller right now? What is the reason why this would actually be a good space controlling move? Well, one of the things that I told you earlier when Chun-Li is poking at the opponent, you know, I said one of your goals in that example was to cause the opponent to clam up, right? We're trying to cause the opponent to over-rely on defense so that they block too much. This will allow you to dash in and apply the pressure. We talked about how, you know, you're trying to gain the advantage in neutral, and the example I showed with Chun was to hit the opponent enough that they get scared of your buttons, that they stop doing anything, and the opponent can dash up against you. Well, that is what it turns out that this kind of a button is for. What you're trying to do is stop movement. So while that button can lose to a lot of other pokes from Chun-Li and such, what you're trying to do now is predict, anticipate, or guess that your opponent wants to run forward, right? So a lot of times if your opponent dashes in on you like this, it's so fast you don't have the time to react to the forward dash and stop their movement. Dashes in general in a lot of fighting games are very quick. And if you are caught asleep at the wheel, your opponent's going to dash at you. So hitting buttons early, like so, will actually preemptively stop them from dashing if you can, you know, just guess in the right situation. And, you know, okay, right there, perfect example right there. I've programmed the computer to walk back and forth and then dash randomly all of a sudden out of nowhere. That's the whole goal. Now, one of the toughest things is when you set it to a true randomizer, it's hard to actually simulate a real match. But a lot of times, if you can read the opponent wants to get in on you, then that's what you do. You all of a sudden start throwing out buttons like this so that the enemy will dash into them because you've thrown this move out preemptively. This is one of the main ideas of space controlling, is that you're hitting buttons to stop people from coming at you, right? You're stopping them from being able to dash in and get that advantage. So in other words, if you see your opponent Chun-Li poke at you a bunch with a, you know, heavy punch and then a stand medium kick and a heavy punch, and you feel like that they've substantially scared you enough into not hitting buttons, and you predict they're going to now dash forward to take advantage of it, that's when you start throwing out a move like this. It's quick, it's fast, and if they dash forward, a lot of times you'll hit them. And you can see that when I set the computer to random, there's a lot of bad timings to throw this out. If I throw this out and then they dash afterwards, I'm kind of in a bad situation again, etc. I talked about how, you know, space controlling too much is a commitment. And you can give your opponent the ability to come in at you and really cause you problems. So that's why you just don't want to sit here and throw out buttons like this all day saying, don't dash at me, don't dash at me, because then the opponent can really take advantage of that and jump at you, or they can find the opportunity to dash in after your button whiffs, etc., etc. But if you have a strong read on your opponent that they're going to come forward and dash at you, this is when you start throwing out moves like this. If you have watched me stream Street Fighter V before, one of the things that you'll see me quantify opponents as are dashy players or not dashy players. I'll play against a lot of players and I'll be like, oh, this guy likes to dash a lot. He's a very dashy player. And as soon as I find out they're a dashy player, then I start throwing out buttons like this to stop them from dashing at me. There are other higher level tactics that I can also cancel this into special moves as well. We talked about canceling into special moves. I don't want to get into it, but that way, if the opponent does dash into it, you can actually turn your attack into a knockdown, into advantage situation, basically. Like I said, I don't want to get to too much details. This is a high level tactic that I'll talk about later. Like this, for example, so like I preemptively stop them, and if they don't forward dash, nothing happens. So it's kind of an advanced tactic. I just wanted to mention that here because I know some people are going to talk about this whiff option select thing, and all these words are being thrown out and it's super confusing, but I just want to throw this out there for people who are kind of in the know, and also to just kind of give you an example of how fighting games grow from these basic concepts. Like, it starts at these basic concepts, but as you keep playing fighting games, they grow so much in complexity, and again, this is where a lot of the joy of fighting games comes from. So there you go. That is some visual examples of poking and space controlling. And everybody in the chat, oh, say hi to my cat Jasmine. Or everybody on YouTube, say hi to my cat Jasmine. But that is just the first section of Footsies. That was just this. Poking and space controlling. A lot of stuff to talk about in Footsies here. A lot of stuff to talk about.